Jamie?
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Good. All right. I even got my Harvard hat, but I'm going to take it off how about halfway.
I
I
have my Harvard mug and I'm wearing a Harvard shirt, so there we go.
got an H, but you're not exactly sure. Is it my name or is it Harvard?
Ah, it works both ways.
Right?
You get to double dip.
There you go.
That's
How you
awesome.
doing?
I'm good, man. How have you been?
Good. Good. Just came back from another weekend traveling within the U.S. Since I can't travel abroad, I'm just trying to do as much as I can traveling locally.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I'm stuck here in Cambridge still,
I can imagine. I can imagine.
taking short drives around New England.
There
That's
you
fun.
go. And great work with the new board and all the great work that you guys have been doing.
Thank you. You should join the board again soon.
I may, and who knows? Who knows?
You still have time. You still have a year and a half to think
We
about
got another year and a half. See what happens. See what happens.
it. No rush at all.
All right, and we're gonna have we'll have questions coming in as well. I know that there's gonna be a Q&A of the session. I've got the agenda up, and if there's any
Great.
questions, just let me know. Otherwise, you can just there.
Yeah, I mean, we have 25, 30 people with us already, so maybe we can get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Zahawi. I'm subbing here for Alexandra Chen, our vice president, who couldn't join us today, unfortunately. We are here to talk about how to apply and get into Harvard. And with us is Hamada Zahawi. And Hamada, I'm not going to introduce you. I'm not going to do you justice. So all yours.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So I'll make it very brief. My name is Hamada Zahawi. As my good friend Raja said, I served with the board of the Harvard Arab Alumni Association in the previous term as the director of Harvard Relations. In terms of background, I studied in Egypt primarily. Growing up, I went to middle school and high school in Cairo in a British school. I then came to the U.S. to do my undergraduate studies at UCLA. And then went on to do my law degree at UC Berkeley, did my first master's at Cambridge University in England, and then my second master's at Harvard, where I met Raja and the team of the Harvard Arab Alumni Associations. When I was at Harvard, I was also president of the Harvard Arab Student Association. So I was very much involved, and in all the different schools I was in, I was very much involved in Arab relations as well and representation. During that interim time, between splitting my time as an attorney and an entrepreneur, I also created a company called Right Track Admissions that helps people get into undergraduate and graduate schools around the world. That was primarily due to my own difficulties getting into universities. I never had strong standardized scores, which probably could be because I studied in a British system in Egypt and never really had that mentality of being able to master the standardized tests. And so I didn't do well in my SAT, my SAT, my LSAT, or my GRE. So I really had to focus on the story I told. And because of that, we were able to figure that there is actually a formula that works for getting into programs throughout the world and getting and securing funds. And that's really the genesis of Right Track, which started in 2008 and has continued to this day. I have a team of 10 experts spread around the world that really have mastered the process of getting into top schools with challenging backgrounds.
That's awesome. Thank you for the comprehensive background. And you and Right Track Admission is about the most perfect fit we can have for a session on how to apply and get into Harvard. Folks who are still joining us, if you can mention in the comments if you're interested in undergrad, Harvard College, or if you're interested in any of the master's or PhD programs, so we can tailor the content to the specific program you're interested in. And while we sort of wait on that, I think, Hamada, you touched on a very interesting point around standardized scores and how many people applying internationally from the Arab world in particular are not as well trained as those who grow up in the US to take those tests well and score highly on them. Can you share some of your thoughts sort of on how people should think about sort of your scores, the story, the recommendation, all the factors that come into applying and getting into a place like Harvard?
So obviously it depends on the degree. You mentioned that there's the college, pretty much in college, there's not as many transfers, but there's your college admissions, which obviously you're a part of, Raja. And then there's going to be all your different graduate programs. I would say there's at least
There's
15
12 schools.
Yeah, 12 schools, maybe 15 different degrees, probably even more than that, many more than that. But so it really depends. So for example, A small example is if you're applying to law school, you're going to have a really good standardized score to match a really good GPA. If you apply to business school, your standardized score is extremely important. Your GPA is less important. If you're applying to a master's program, such as the one I applied to at the Kennedy School, your standardized score is not that important. Your GPA is even not, is important, but not as important. It's more about your experience and what you can bring to the table, and so forth. They want to have high scores, but not exceptionally high like in law school. So it really depends on who you're applying to, and how you can offset. And imagine your background like a pie chart, right? And imagine the pie chart has co-equal parts in it. There's about 4 slices, right? You have your GPA and your academic record. You have your application, right? You have your experience and letters of recommendation. Then you have your standardized. And in some schools, that pie chart starts to shift, right? The standardized test takes up more space in the pie, the GPA less, and so on and so forth. So you have to think about which school you're applying to and how important the standardized test is. But most importantly, to your point, don't feel that the standardized test is your be-all, end-all. If you don't succeed in the standardized test, there's other ways, and I'm proof in the pudding that there's other ways where you can actually be able to excel without having a phenomenal standardized score. And one extra point to add to that, don't forget, a lot of schools are going test optional, right? So because they're going test optional, a lot of opportunities in terms of doing well in the standardized test or not doing well in the standardized test are now there because of COVID. So the good news is standardized test is not the be-all, end-all. It's important, but not the be-all, end-all.
Right. No, thank you for that. Sort of, you start to touch on one of the questions that we got from our viewers here. Someone asked, how important is the GPA to your application, period? Especially coming from the Arab world, it tends to be the one score that determines which university you can go to and what you study.
So how important is your GPA?
Yes.
Again, like I said, it's really dependent on which school you're applying to. But in the end of the day, in terms of standardized tests, in terms of GPA, it's mission critical, and it's mission critical for several factors. One, if you don't have strong experience, strong SAT score, the GPA will take the day, right? And imagine your GPA is really what I would call merit-based and not achievement-based. Merit-based because it's taken you 4 years to achieve. You're applying for as an undergraduate for throughout high school, or even for a graduate program. It took you 4 years in high school to achieve your GPA. It took you 4 years in college to achieve your GPA, right? While your standardized test is just one moment in time that you may or may not have done exceptionally well. And I believe that a lot of schools are shifting over to that model, right? MIT, for example, punted on the whole concept of standardized testing in the fact that you can take it, but it's not going to be necessarily dispositive to your total application. So in this case, again, your GPA is mission critical to kind of offset, and that's exactly how I did very well as an undergraduate, and I kept it all the way through, always claiming that in an academic environment, I'm able to do exceptionally well. In a standardized test, I'm not. So please see my academic record as more of a better indicator for my ability to perform than is my SAT score or my standardized. Number two, if you don't have great experience, work experience, again, a great GPA can at least, you can say, well, look, I don't have a lot of work experience, but I did very well in school, to show that methodically over time, I actually have a very good schedule laid out, and I'm very responsible, and I can take care of my extracurricular activities as well as my academic record and be able to do both effectively well.
Right, and this is a great segue to sort of another set of questions that we got about the personal statements and the diversity statements.
Yep.
So can you tell us a little bit more about sort of what those statements are, how people should use them?
Sure.
And then I'll follow up with questions after.
Well, you can imagine that's the one I've got the most to talk about, probably because, again, it's what saved me. I would say my essays for all the graduate schools I applied to really is what made the day for me and got me into these top programs. So I would say, from that perspective, the first thing you want to kind of take note of is the personal statement is so fundamentally important. It's the anchor of your whole application. You don't want to wing it and keep it at the end. You want to make it unique, and you want to follow it in a story. So the best way I can say to you is, well, even before I get to that, let me distinguish the two: the diversity statement, personal statement, which is very, very popular for law school. A personal statement is really asking you, and for law school, why is it? What have you done in your life, and why has that led you to want to apply to law school? Mm-hmm. In the same exact way as what have you done in your life, and why is it now that you want to go to a school of design, school of education, business school, right? So that's really what the personal statement is answering. The diversity statement is saying, listen, given your background, how are you going to add value to the class? Regardless of what program it is. I mean, regardless of the school, you want to basically say, I am, this is my background. You're talking about racial identity, ethnic identity, sexual orientation. You're talking about social difficulties and hardships, medical relations, travel, anything that really distinguishes you. And you cannot tell me, a lot of people are like, well, I don't have anything to say. This is, I'm very plain Jane. I've got great grades, but I really have. If that's the case, and we've got a bunch of robots out there because everybody's got the same profile, which we know is not the case. The reality is everybody has some kind of background, some kind of change in their life that may have made a monstrous difference in terms of who they are and what they can bring to the class. And what you're bringing to the class is really the class discussion, the tolerance levels, the ability to work well with others, because in the end of the day, the academic environment is a microcosm to the rest of the world. Right? So if you can get along well with your peers, if you can succeed and lead with your peers, if you've done things in your life that can you add value to that effect, that's going to help you when you actually enter the job market. So these are the kind of important factors I kind of want to distinguish the diversity statement and the personal statement. Now to get, I don't know if you want me to get a little more granular in terms of the personal statement.
So actually one question that came up sort of on the submitted questions, and folks who are viewing, feel free to sort of ask more. Someone asked, my diversity statement is very similar to my personal statement. Any tips there?
Yeah, so you have to distinguish them. And the way that I usually do this, the key to success is I write down 10 factors about what's important. I really want to make sure that the university gets a chance to hear from me. So I may mention, I studied, like when I applied to Harvard, I said, that I'm a lawyer, that I'm, Middle Eastern, that I volunteered, that I worked for the government, that I also did nonprofit work, that I've done voter outreach, and I wrote down all these 10 factors I had to make sure Harvard knew about. Then I took them and parsed them out between what's going to be in my personal statement, what's going to be in my diversity statement, what's going to end up in my resume, and what's going to end up in the addendum if I need an addendum. Right. Now, for the Kennedy School, there was it's crazy this year, there's 9 essays. So there was more than enough space to put everything in there, all the 10 fundamental points. So the way that you can really distinguish it, if you have these 10 core points and make sure that you parse them out, not necessarily equally, but just parse them out between the 2 applications, and you know that there won't be a lot of redundancy. The minute there is redundancy and repetition, imagine this, Raja, you won't have the opportunity to interview. I believe as an undergraduate at Harvard, you do. But for most graduate schools, other than the MBA program, I believe, I don't think almost any other program does at Harvard, you only have these documents as an interview for you. So you want to make sure that you've given them the most of your profile as possible. So just make sure, if there's going to be repetition, put the nuggets in your personal statement. Small little nuggets, like breadcrumbs. That would
ties back clearly.
Exactly, that would expand upon it in the diversity statement. So maybe mention something about your diversity in a very small way in your personal statement, but then have it expand much more in your diversity statement.
What advice do you have for people whose diversity is why they're applying for, say, law school, right? Say a daughter of immigrants, felt sort of the system is working against her, so her diversity is why she wants to get involved.
Yes and no, because your diversity alone shouldn't merit why you want to go to a school. What merits you getting into a school is why you're going to excel and how you're going to add to the thing. I can have somebody who's like me, Iraqi and Kurdish, and I say, I want to get into law school because I'm Iraqi and Kurdish. I couldn't care less if you're Iraqi and Kurdish. What's that going to do for me? What happens if you go back, work in a corporate law firm, and never decide to do anything with your life? What difference does that make? Your identity will not get you and should not get you. I'm not a firm believer of that concept. I am a firm believer of saying, this is my identity. This is what I've done to celebrate my identity, to advocate for my identity. And people who have mixed identities that also may have been persecuted or discriminated and so forth, this is what I plan to do with it. So you have to take your identity and not as a stagnant object, but what you're going to do with it as a Trojan horse into something much better, right? And for me, in terms of my story, being an Iraqi Kurd in 2003 when I applied, to me it was all about what can I do to help, blaze the trail for the new Iraq, so to speak. What can I do to create a country that is more welcoming to a heterogeneous population? That's all I wrote about in my personal statement. And lo and behold, guess what? It's an authentic statement, because 9 years later, I was doing exactly that work. It wasn't just celebrating, saying, hey guys, let me into Berkeley because I'm Iraqi and Kurdish. They let me into Berkeley because they realized that I could do more. And when I was at the school, that's when I created the Berkeley Journal of Middle Eastern Islamic Law, right? I became the editor-in-chief of that journal. So therefore, we separated that identity. That's why that's what they're looking for. What can you do with your identity to really be proactive about it, and what you can do in the rest of your life?
Right. And this is sort of a good segue to interviews. You mentioned that many don't offer interviews, especially for most graduate schools.
Right.
But for undergrad, and then for maybe the law school at Harvard, maybe the business school, which interviews, any tips on what people sort of should use these interviews for? What are they an opportunity to sort of tell about yourself that you haven't told already?
Super tough question, because there's a lot there to unpack. Tons. I mean, we can't even tell you how many people we've had to prep for MBA admissions, for college admissions. There's a lot to unpack there. And I'm sure you have even more. I would love to ask you that question, especially maybe like one or two of the fundamental questions that you got when you were an undergraduate being interviewed. But from what I've always told people is obviously be authentic, practice, right? And obviously be authentic is very difficult, and be like, well, what the hell does that mean? I get it. But the point is you want to be yourself, because if they don't admit you on who you are, then really you don't belong in that school, and that school doesn't deserve you. Fact, right? Move on with your life, right? So in this case, be authentic about who you are and practice. Practice a lot of the fundamental questions and so forth, and be ready to provide examples. Don't just say I'm great and here's, and that's it. Just here, I'm great, here's why. Here's what I've done. Be humble, mission critical. You don't want to kind of overplay. As a Harvard college and as an MBA, obviously you want to have examples, as I said, for every one of your job qualifications, for everything you've done, how you plan to add to the class, and then make sure you always have 1 to 3 potential questions that you can add to it. For example, at the Kennedy School, I got a scholarship through the Center for Public Leadership, and we were interviewed as candidates for the fellowship, not just for ELI, which is the Emirates Leadership Initiative, which is what I got, but also for other fellowships there. And for those questions, I made very sure that I was very succinct. I answered my questions as quickly as I possibly could, providing examples for each one. I was as clear and cogent as I possibly could be. And I always was ready to answer or have a question for each one of the interviewees, because I actually read before the background of the interviewees and knew exactly what kind of question I could ask each and every one of them. And it wasn't going to be the same, canned question, one that was really specific to them.
Right. And sort of in full disclosure, I do interview on behalf of Harvard College for students in the Boston area who come from underrepresented schools. And what I can share about the college portion of the interview is that it is an opportunity to tell the admissions office things that you could not put in your application for whatever reason. You're limited in the number of essays and the stories you can tell with your recommendation letters. But it's also the opportunity to show sort of why you're an interesting person. To your point, Hamad, like, a ton of people have perfect SAT scores and perfect GPAs. Harvard can only accept so many people every year. So why should it be you above and beyond anybody else? And a lot of that is, are you going to be not just sort of a good student, but a good person? Like, is this somebody that would do well, not just in the classroom, but in the dorm, in the clubs, on a sports team, in a social setting? Is this someone who sort of, after 4 years, will be a good representation of the school above and beyond just their intelligence? And you should think about the interviews as a way to just show how you're different from all the other smart people applying.
Yeah, and don't oversell yourself, but just 100%. As yourself, because when you start overselling yourself to show like I'm different, I can dance faster, I don't know, sing, I can crunch numbers better. If it seems unauthentic and you're just trying to sell that, that I've done that. I've interviewed the folks before, and I smell it like from a mile away, and I'm like, dude, stay away from those kind of people, because if they're inauthentic in this 20-minute, 30-minute interview, you can only imagine what they're going to be like when they start at the university.
Exactly. It's show, don't tell, right? If you're the person writing their recommendation after an interview, and you interview 5 people who say, I'm a leader, it's all reads the same, right? There's no differentiation. But if somebody tells you, I did X, Y, and Z, right, and I led my class into A, B, and C, that's a much more compelling story.
Exactly.
So we've talked about, for those who just joined, we talked about scores, GPAs. We've talked about standardized tests sort of for a short period of time. We talked about personal statements. We talked about interviews. Another core portion of any application is recommendation letters or reference letters. So can you tell us a little bit more about how to think about those?
So the recommendation letters, you need to make sure, first and foremost, that you have to have an advocate, a cheerleader for you. You don't want to just go to the recommender and just say, hey, can you write me a recommendation? And they'll write a mediocre letter. The sad reality is recommenders outside of the US, especially to certain countries in Europe and so forth, are horrible. They end up, you could be the top of your class. You could have gotten, exceptional grades. You could have done really well in the professional environment, and they'll still say that you're a good candidate, mediocre candidate, right? Or I say good, I wouldn't say mediocre. And that sucks because in America, people tend to be very ingratiating, right? You tend to overflower everything. So you want to make sure that you're getting somebody as possible that's going to be very flowery to your background, very, very supportive of what you want to do. The ways that you guys do that is I would have an opportunity to have a coffee with the individual, talk to them about why you're applying, talk about your role within the company or your role within the academic environment, show them the transcript, show them your personal statement, you have it, and then try to make sure that they cover certain fundamental points. Something else I've done is I've provided bullet points, for example, to the recommender, if they're open to it, to show them the different things I would really want to kind of bring out in the statement, in the recommendation. And oftentimes they ask us, for example, for law, what kind of things do you want to see? Well, I want to make sure that the recommender covers analytical skills, oratory skills, the ability to work well with teams, anything that really kind of makes me as an individual. If you're talking about for an MBA, from a professional perspective, as a leader, somebody who can manage under difficulty, somebody really has incredible potential, even saying, hey, listen, I want you to come back and work with us. Things like that are all very, very important. I want to make sure that you conclude with saying that they support their application wholeheartedly, right? And from that perspective, since they support your application wholeheartedly, they will welcome you back whatever they can to support you in your bid to go to that school. But make sure that you give them all what they need to know so that you could really stand out from that perspective.
Right. And some of the advice I got when I was asking for recommendation letters is to actually share a copy of my essays to help the recommenders actually know sort of how I'm pitching myself and sort of complement it with stories in there.
100%. And if you can, you want each recommender to cover a certain base of your profile. Don't, you don't want to have every recommender say that your weakness is
attention to detail, right? Whatever it is.
Strength is oratory presentation, right? Make sure that they can cover different aspects of it, and make sure that you come to them well in advance. I can tell you I've worked with quite a few clients. I remember one distinctly who was applying to Wharton, bent over backwards to have the application done first round, and the recruiter emailed him, I think, the day or two afterwards and said, so when am I meant to submit this? And so he ended up getting pushed in the second round. Thankfully, they got into Wharton, but it was very, very difficult for them because they had worked so hard to meet the round one deadline, which was sometime in September, October. Now they got pushed all the way to January. So you want to make sure that you're well on top of your recommender and providing that to them and being a resource to them. And make sure that you don't just hit them up like last minute or before and say, hey, listen, I want you to write my recommendation. Give them, be flowery to them, because that's what they'll remember when they're typing your application.
Yep. And the advice I got is to follow up after the sort of decision comes out, positive or negative, just to make sure that you're being personal with them, that you're building that rapport for the next time you apply. Hopefully they'll recommend you again, but make sure you're not being transactional. It's like, I need this from you, submitted it, and that's the last time I talked to you ever.
And that's a great point. And the fact is you can follow up with them, because I would say at least one of my 3 recommendations I've used for at least 2 of the graduate schools I applied to back to back. And so you want to make sure that they can do that. And when you're writing a recommendation, don't have them submit a recommendation for you to get into an MBA program, then submit the same recommendation when you're applying to law school or you're applying to
tailored.
You want to make sure that you're tweaking it and so forth. There's a lot more we can discuss there, but those are the fundamental points.
Yeah. We got a question actually, taking a small step back around sort of video essays or sort of video interviews. Some schools are asking people to submit a short video to talk about themselves or experiences. Yep. So any tips for those video essays?
Yeah, I remember one distinctly I just worked on with a client that I helped get into MIT Sloan. And one of their essays for MIT Sloan was a video essay. I want to say it was like 59 seconds. I want to say maybe it was a minute. I don't think it was a very long one. So we rehearsed it a bazillion times. We scripted it. We rehearsed it. She had a good backdrop. It was in a country in the Middle East, so she had a good backdrop behind her. One of the takes she did, there was a cat walking by, which I thought was really cute. I'm like, you should include that. So it's about how you present yourself. How do you look? You don't want to be overly, I think don't be over the top in terms of like suited and booted. I think something a little bit more relaxed, but not too relaxed, right? You want to be articulate and you want to be cogent and you want to like smile. Don't be fake. And that's good. It takes practice, right? I mean, I do videos on YouTube all the time for Right Track. And I've, from the first one I've done to the one I've most recently done, it improves over time. So you want to keep practicing and how you feel comfortable in front of the camera. and have those fundamental points laid out. You don't want to kind of wing it, but then don't over script it as something on like a teleprompter. That also is going to take away from authenticity. I think reading up a little bit about public speaking, getting a couple of tips of what, main things they do. That's something that I do quite often is, study and learn by public speaking. It's mission critical that genuine, authentic, to the point, cogent, make sure that your eyes meet their eyes, so to speak, on your video, smile when you can, so on and so forth. Those are very important factors. And, rehearse. That's for the lazier admissions reviewers, maybe one of the few things that they really focus on, because it's just something, it's a medium so used as having that medium of interaction.
Right. This sort of, we've covered your GPA, your standardized tests, personal statement interviews, rec letters, video submissions. We're getting a few questions about medical school in particular, which tends to have a sort of a fairly unique application process. Can you tell us a little bit more about how to think about the medical school application process?
So you've got a primary statement, right? And that primary statement, don't overthink it, because at the end of the day, most schools are going to ask you for secondaries. It's just a fact, because they want to make the money from the secondaries, and so they're going to let the primary statement kind of run its. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to throw everything into the primary statement and leave very little to discuss in the secondaries. So you want to, first of all, start thinking about your primary statement as early as April, right? So that by June, first week of June, when the applications open up, boom, you hit the ground running, you've got your statement ready to rock and roll, you've got the rest of your application, you have your MCAT. The primary statement, again, you want to make sure that you're unique. Take one of the unique stories that you have and kind of, embellish upon it, right? But be very weary and make sure you can. I think that probably be prudent that you take a look at some of the past secondaries. So you can imagine what kind of secondary questions they're going to be asking you for those particular. Obviously, the other thing you want to kind of consider is that, most applicants I've worked with on med school, I would say minimum 15 schools people apply to, upward of 40, 50, because some schools don't even require secondary, but your primary and then the dots. But the idea is that you want to have a primary statement that opens the door to them, that introduces you to them, but get ready, because the secondaries are going to be probably the most important part of the application, because that's where the schools get to see what how you're going to run their school, and not just the primary that they know 50 different programs.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you. Speaking of sort of school-specific questions, we got a question about the Kennedy School, which you're a graduate of.
Right.
Any tips for the Kennedy School essay, and how do you convince admissions that you're a good fit for HKS if most of your experience is engineering or business?
Got it. Well, first of all, let's remember it's not one. I've worked with, I can't even tell you how many applicants to the Kennedy School before I went to the Kennedy School, and that's actually how I found out about the Kennedy School mid-career program. Oddly enough, is I was working with clients on it. Wow, this actually is a really cool program. And I was working with the U.S. government at the time, doing international law, and I was like, well, you know what? Let me apply it. So first thing you want to know is that it's not one essay. This year, no joke, I think the whole application, 2 different resumes, an addendum, and they have 6 essays, 2 long and 4 short. So you're going to have to, you want to make sure that you've covered a lot of there. But the question that I think will come up, has come up, is the why. Essentially, you're asking yourself about why Harvard. Why does Harvard make sense for you, or the Kennedy? So I'll answer that. The first question you asked, which is, what happens if you have a very technical background? How do you parlay that into a Kennedy School about policy? Well, you've got to indicate that what you plan, what you've done in policy, or doing something for the public good. In fact, one of the essays asks about Kennedy's famous, not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. That comes in fundamentally to one of your primary questions. So they're going to ask you about what you have done in terms of exhibiting leadership in a public, almost like in a public sector environment, or something that does for the public good. So they're going to ask you that up front. So all you've been doing is programming, and now want to get into the Kennedy School, that's going to be a tough sell, right? But I've worked with people who are like literally just recently who have a tech background. Mm-hmm. And the way that we parlayed it is that the tech company actually had public good utility, and that they want to transfer their technical skills into a policy skill. Because just look at the guys from Capitol Hill and Grills, right? Your Twitter guys, Facebook guys, your Google guys, right? Right now, rarely is in the sphere, right? So they need to learn skills about negotiating, about good presentation skills, about how do you think about, like one of their policies that they have is is limiting freedom of speech. And there's a certain code in the government now that allows them underneath that code to be able to shut down speech that would be deemed to be, discriminatory or hateful and so forth. And so they're playing with that, but that policy itself, they need to understand it. And so therefore, you could really parlay that into having a technical background and wanting to understand policy and negotiations for the betterment of what you want to do from that perspective. That covers that question. The other question about why yes, go. I just literally recorded a video. I've been doing these every place. I was in Sequoia National Park, so I was out there, recorded a video about the why school, and I always cover that with 3 fundamental areas. Number 1 is academic and resources. Number 2 is community. And number 3 is location. So anytime you cover any school about why, that why portion of the essay, which could be the penultimate paragraph of your law school application, it could be a standalone essay that they're having. Like a lot of schools are asking, why our school, as opposed to just a general. And so when you talk about academics, you want to talk about professional classes, journals, clinics, programs, concentration, research, the same thing, right? You want to talk about research that they go into, which professors are working on that research that really adheres to what you want to do. Community, you want to divide into 2. You have your present community on campus. For example, for me, I talked a lot about HASA, about the Harvard Arab Student Association when I was applying to the Kennedy School, because I want to be involved in it, even though it's part of, but not exclusively part of the Kennedy School. I talked about the different caucuses that exist at the Kennedy School, the different PICs, public interest groups that they have at the Kennedy School. So I talk about what community exists on campus, and the alumni network, which is exactly what we've been doing at Harvard Arab Alumni Association, and all the work that we've been doing part of HAA, so the Alumni Association. And then finally, the third branch about the location. So if you're at Harvard, or that, you want to also talk about the bigger community, and then the box location. You want to talk about being in the U.S. You want to talk about internship opportunities. You want to talk about professional opportunities. You want to talk about social opportunities, going to the theater, sports, whatever it is, on a bigger level, right? So those are the 3 branches that you want to use to cover, whether it's Kennedy School or any other school, about the school.
And this is actually a great segue into one of the questions we got around being an international student applying. You may not have access to the same extracurriculars. You don't have sort of the ACT. You might not have AP classes. You might be studying in Arabic, which is a completely different sort of system.
Right.
How do you think about sort of positioning yourself to compete with an otherwise very American pool of applicants that's specifically trained to sort of apply and get into these kind of schools?
Well, again, look at my background. I studied in a British school. I did my GCSE and my IB. So it wasn't really at the time. That was like 100 years ago. So it was before IB was even something that was, interesting to the US. But I distinguished myself in the fact that I did think that I knew would still be acceptable and interesting to the US. A lot of volunteer work. The international students are horrible at that. It's like completely miss the volunteer aspect, not because they're mean, just because it's not really tied part and parcel with their educational system and so forth. When I did the IB, thankfully, as one core component of the IB, was being able to do community service and so forth. So you want to make sure that you have the community service aspect and the volunteer aspect. You want to be involved in curricular activities. Even if you don't have them, create them. Create like-minded groups that you can kind of do that. And that's even more interesting for the school than just plugging yourself into Boy Scouts, plugging yourself into whatever is general. So even create that affinity group. Right now, I'm considering creating a network for international development professionals in the United States that are of Middle Eastern background potential. It doesn't exist, so we'll create it. Why not? Now we're all behind our computer. How easy is it for me to snap this thing up, gather some people who are like-minded, and create a networking group, or create a group that can actually have a benefit, even if you're behind a screen. So that's from the extracurricular. From the academic, obviously, if you go to an Arabic-speaking program or you want to make sure that your English is up to snuff. If it's not up to snuff and you can't master these essays, then you better take a year out, do ESL, right? Either come to the US and do ESL, English is a second language, get your scores and your grades up and be able to master it. Because if you don't have at least a mastery of English, then you're hurting yourself coming to the United States and applying to universities here without a mastery of English. And I'm sure that if you have the ability, and we've seen this with our parents and our parents' parents, who've come out here with very little and made a hell of a lot out of themselves, because they eventually, and English is not a very difficult language to learn. And once you do, then you can basically apply all the intelligence that you have in that respective language studied into the English language and be able to apply more effectively.
No, and that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I can share my personal story. I went to high school in Syria, right? So it was all in Arabic. There's no such thing as an AP. Like SAT, I had to sort of get books from Lebanon to study because I just didn't have access to anything in Syria. And when it came to extracurriculars, when I was working on the application, I remember I was texting some of my cousins who grew up in the US, and I said, well, that concept doesn't exist here. When we have a longer weekend, teachers give us more homework because they say, like, oh, are you going to go play sort of soccer on the street? Otherwise, just sit down and study. So what I ended up writing about is tutoring my friends, just helping them with their homework, helping them study for exams, and how I helped them get their grades up. And that worked for me. And I know sort of other applicants from Syria also sort of took a year off. To your point, one of them worked on a publication around making sort of biology more accessible. Others tried to sort of also tutor other people for the International Science Olympiads. And that really stood out in their application. It's sort of, there is an opportunity to create your own sort of extracurricular experiences and talk about them. The big caveat is just make sure that whatever you're telling it truthfully. You're not sort of over embellishing or telling things that are dishonest, because they'll be able to tell if you have the wrong kind of detail in your application, or they sort of ask you follow-up questions in the interview and you're inconsistent or you can't answer. They'll just discount that experience altogether, and that won't help.
100%. I mean, look, there's going to be opportunities or times where, you're going to say, I led a team of 5, it's actually a team of 7. Don't worry about it. But if you're like, I raised $200,000 and you raised $2,000, trust me. I always tell the story of one of the Yahoo CEOs who had lied about his PhD, and they found out, and the guy got fired, and he was the CEO of Yahoo. I mean, you're like, don't lie about certain things that if it could be investigated, if they could find other people that can vouch for it, then don't lie about it, right? It's just, there's no point of doing that, because in the end of the day, it's going to come back to haunt you.
Oh, 100%. One quick story to tell. There was an applicant from an Asian country who made up an entire school, had a website on, faked the stamps, the transcripts, everything. And the interviewer didn't recognize the address of the school, so he went to Google Maps and there was nothing. It was just an empty plot of land where the school was supposed to be. The applicant just sort of, his application was canceled. I think Harvard might have told other schools as well to be on the lookout for that fraud. You don't want that to happen to you.
You definitely don't. And the schools have an incentive to do that. They will put you on blast with the other schools, because if they recognize the fraud, they didn't inform the other schools could be upset at them because they could pass it. And don't forget, look at the admission scandal that's been plaguing the Harvard even now. Right? We had 2 fencers who literally graduated from Harvard, who weren't really like professional fencers, but the guy got greased. I don't know if you read about this. Yep. The guy actually paid for his house in I don't know what part of Boston, and then he flipped the house for the same exact amount of money, and then ended up buying him a really plush house somewhere in, I don't know, it was Cambridge or something.
He sold the house for way above market, and that was basically the bribe money.
Exactly. So I would say don't get yourself into that situation, because it can destroy the rest of your life. It really can. These people, there's a scarlet letter hung on their heads for the actions that either they committed or their parents committed on their behalf.
With an eye on time, so we've talked about GPA, personal statement, interviews, reference letter, a few other sort of supplementary aspects of the application. It starts to form this holistic picture, and you mentioned the pie at the beginning of the call. So for the benefit of everybody who's joining us now, can you tell us how the application is now judged and evaluated with all these pieces together?
So again, I'm using really a rough pie chart, but imagine you have a pie split into 4, typically. 1 pie is about your academics, 1 pie is about your experience, 1 pie is your application, 1 pie is your standardized score, typically. And they'll fall into that, and in each school, there'll be a bigger request for a certain kind of pie. And for you, you may have a great GPA. Like I had a 3.96 out of UCLA, but my SAT score or my LSAT was like 60th percentile. I mean, they literally thought I was a moron, because they're like, how is this guy's, this is so much better than this, right? But then they dug a little deeper, and because my application literally was bulletproof, because I worked on it for 6 months, then they got to my application, they read it, and then they're like, okay. And really, I got into 1 law school out of 17. So it wasn't
just 1 JD.
Just one school. I got into UC Berkeley. And until now, I was just on a call with the same dean of admissions, talking about admissions, and he was on the call with me with another like 7 deans of admission talking to students from UCSD, and he was on it. And I literally said right there on the call, I said, because of that man, he trusted that this application was worthwhile. I was admitted to Berkeley, and I did everything I could to really excel as a student at Berkeley and make the school proud of admitting me to their program. So that really is all it takes from that perspective.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So now that the application is in, hopefully you get in, you need to pay for the degree now. Harvard's not cheap. Can you tell us a little bit more about financial aid? A lot of people are asking how financial aid works at Harvard, and what can you do if you can't afford tuition?
So I'm going to punt that one back to you, but I will give you my experience with CPL. There's a lot of scholarships at Harvard that if you have to really investigate. When I applied, I thought about my job as almost full time looking for scholarships and scholarships. So I really worked hard on that. I found one several within the Center of Public Leadership. I applied to them, but I applied to a multitude of to applications, and just make sure that your personal statements for those applications are ready to rock and roll. You're not just going to kind of recycle the past stuff. You want to make sure that you really cater to that. So at the Kennedy School, there was a plethora of applications and fellowships that apply to people of different backgrounds. The school itself has a lot of money, but you have to really go look for it. And if you don't find it you need to start looking elsewhere, whether it's private scholarships and so on. And then if you don't get any money, period, I'll tell you this little trick, if it's a trick. When I was at law school, I got $0, but I graduated with a profit, which is unheard of. And the reason I did that is because I worked every summer as a lawyer. I worked during the school year as a grader and as a TA, as a teacher assistant, and I was able to pay off and make more money as a student.
No, that's awesome. So if you wanted to push it back to me, so let me tell you about my experience and then a little bit more about what the Arab Alumni Association is doing. So when I applied to the college, I was on full financial aid. So the way Harvard does admissions, sort of does financial aid for the undergraduate level, is that it is purely need-based. It doesn't matter what your scores are, what your props are. As long as you get in, you submit a separate application that says, here's my parents' income, here's what we can afford. And there's a calculator online that tells you exactly how much you qualify for. And I believe that if your parents make up to, I think, $250,000 a year, Harvard's virtually free. And if they make less, they just cover everything and a little more. So for me, they even covered a return flight to Syria once a year, which I never end up using, so I just spent it on books. But there are all those opportunities out there. And then for the different schools, I know the Kennedy School has the ELI program, which is a scholarship dedicated to folks who are interested, I think, in sort of Middle Eastern affairs and policy. I think PhDs are all fully paid for. And then there are always loan options. I think the business school has some very sort of large options that cover not just your tuition, but any other sort of travel or socializing expenses. So you can build that community. And then the last thing to mention is the Harvard Arab Alumni Association. We have our own sort of dedicated scholarship fund, fully managed by the university. There's no separate application process. Once you apply for financial aid, if you're eligible and you meet our criteria, which is simple, that you've studied in one of the Arab League countries, some of your financial aid might come from that dedicated fund.
Agreed. And remember, the better SAT score you have, the higher chance of getting scholarships. The better grades you have, the higher chance. The more unique profile and excellent your application, the more scholarships you get. The more professional the school, the more difficult it is to get scholarships, like business school or law school. But at the end of the day, even there, you can try to find scholarships for you. And
it's not just sort of the university-specific scholarships. There are external scholarships as well, right?
For sure.
So, for example, Jusur helps fund the education of Syrian folks, Syrian students who are trying to study all over the world now. So everybody should be on the lookout for these opportunities above and beyond financial aid to their schools and the scholarships of those schools.
100%. Like Soros has also one for new Americans who could be of Middle Eastern background. And
no, that's awesome. So with that, can you tell us a little bit more about Right Track Admissions and what you guys offer for students?
For sure. So as I said, the motto of the company is discover your story, get admitted. So it's really all about storytelling and story crafting. That's probably the most important service. But we have 4 key services that kind of work in sequence. We help with guiding, we help with editing, we help with, guiding, brainstorming, editing, and timekeeping. Okay, so guiding, giving you all the information that you really need in a universe with a bunch of crap that exists out there. And so you're sitting there trying to sift blogs. We tell you exactly what you need to be thinking about as it pertains to that program. In terms of brainstorming, We help you come up with the story that really is unique to you. We talked about those 10 fundamental points, spreading it out between the two, and coming up with that hook. And I want to talk about that, and I'm going to take a minute to talk about that, Raja, which is just talking about the way that we build the personal statement, because I've come up with a formula that really, really makes sense. And I was taking a long walk, because I walk now all the time for exercise. So I was taking a long walk, and I came up with this concept I would love to share with your viewers on the storytelling. Then we have editing, which is how to take the story itself, craft it into a perfect personal statement, and we help with the editing process. Of course, it's always led by the actual student, and we would just work with editing it. And finally, with timekeeping, because I cannot tell you, driving me cuckoo bananas, but trying to keep them on track, trying to keep the parents on track, trying to keep everybody sane, especially during this time with all the misinformation, all the craziness that they have to deal with. It's become one of the most important and valuable things that we can do for students right now, is working quickly, efficiently, and what would usually take you weeks to do or months to do, we can fast forward that to like a week in terms of coming up with a story and getting everything on the right track. So that's fundamentally the 4 core pillars of what we do and what we offer. We offer that for college students applying to college. We apply that for graduate in terms of MBA law primarily. We've worked on many medical. We've worked on many graduate as well, and that really kind of plays a role with all the graduate. And really, it's everything that pertains to your application. We don't help you with tutoring. We don't help you with actually assembling your application together. That's really screwed. But what we really help you with is how to actually put a very, very application together. And I literally, like I said, I'm proof of the pudding. The fact that I had horrific scores and still been able to get into the top universities in the world speaks volumes for what we can actually achieve.
Thank you. That's awesome. And thank you, everybody who's with us who submitted questions. Hamad, I have a few questions from the audience. What are your views on reapplying to Harvard after rejection? Particularly, should we assume they'll look at your rejected application again, above and beyond the one you submitted?
It's a tough one because it depends how long ago you applied, and sometimes you keep your application record. I was working with recently who had that same video, and so you do want to kind of play and change up your application to show what you've done since. Obviously, you can't reinvent the wheel, and don't want to contradict what you said previously. I had another applicant who had said something like they had given a monetary value for which they were able to make for their company, and in fact, that wasn't true. And when I pushed on that, they're like, "Yeah, you know what? I didn't make that much money." I'm like, "Well, forget about including that in your resume because that's going to hurt you down the road. Just leave it as it was because you don't want to contradict it. So make sure you don't contradict what you had before. Make sure you update the school with what you've done." You simply want to show, because if you've shown a huge marked improvement in terms of the areas that you felt were weaker before, that's going to help serve you very well down.
No, thank you for that. That makes a lot of sense. Second question, will admissions be different during COVID? Do you think that chances of admission are relatively high because of COVID?
First, I want everyone on this call and everyone period to go to my YouTube and subscribe, because on the YouTube, we've covered so many of these questions in very, very short, absolutely awesome background, really cool background. So you can enjoy the background scene. And one of the questions we covered, one of our amazing, amazing experts, Stanford Medical School, she went into Michigan, Oxford Rhodes Scholar. We covered that in a back and forth with her. And the reality is, and we're going to try to do this as fast as possible. We both talk pretty fast, right? Try to do this really quickly. The reality is, people who got it last year found out that they have to do online education. Decided, quite a few of them, to defer. When they deferred, right, that meant that the school, if they got accepted, their deferment accepted, that means when they deferred, that means they had to save a seat for them for this coming fall.
Right.
They saved the seat, that means there's less seats.
Fewer seats, right.
Which means that it's probably become harder. The other factor is people like me. I wish I had applied during COVID and rewind 20 years because I had a horrible SAT score, right? So I could have not worried about the SAT and applied with a fantastic application and probably got into better schools than I did. The reality is, again, so many people are going to, who would have suffered because of the SAT, are now going to be recognized among their peers based on their academics and their stories. So I think it's going to be harder this year than any previous year because of the seats left, as well as how the SAT now is no longer evaluated, or the LSAT is not as strongly evaluated, the GMAT and so on and so forth, because of all the people that have suffered from it. Let me quickly tell you this. If you have suffered from COVID, if something has happened to you, and not just everybody has, but if something happened to your family member, make sure to include that in the addendum and talk about that, okay? Don't make it your personal statement. I don't think that would serve you well, but put it in an addendum to back. If it hasn't impacted you, and just impacted you the way that's impacted almost everybody regularly, do not include it, because it's going to make it look stupid for you to sit there and cry, oh my God, I worked so much and I really sitting at home and I got fat. Nobody's going to care. But think about the person whose parent died, or the person whose family suffered, or the person who has to stay at home and make for his parents because they're suffering from it, right? We have colleagues literally who work for your organization who have close relatives that are literally suffering and potentially dying from this disease. Those are the kind of people that's the opportunity you want to discuss that. So use that for that opportunity.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And then sort of one of the last questions we have with the 8 minutes remaining is, why choose Harvard over other Ivy League schools?
I mean, it's seriously, talk about brand equity. It's not even. I went to Cambridge. Nobody cared in America. Nobody really cared when I was applying nationally to jobs. It just didn't matter to them. Even if you go to Oxford or Cambridge, it just doesn't have the same equity, the same ring, right? When I applied to Harvard, the network that we have, that for one is phenomenal. And that's because we all come in saying Harvard network, and we become the self-fulfilling prophecy. We are that network, and because everybody expects it to be good, we make it better because we're the students who want to profit from something that was one of the things that drew us to the university. If we all didn't think the network existed, we probably wouldn't be part of it. And that's exactly what has happened to all the universities I've gone to, whether Berkeley, UCLA, and the other ones, is they're so big, they're underfunded, and they're disparate. They don't really keep the union together as Harvard does. That to me was one of the most important factors to Harvard. And it gives you a lot of added credibility from that perspective. You go to Harvard, it's just, you know what I'm talking about. I don't have to tell you that it's still, and it's not, the community school is not the best school in public policy. Some of the other programs at Harvard are not the best. There are a lot of better programs in that specific program. I'm not talking about the undergrad schools, but at the end of the day, go underwater basket weaving at Harvard. You got the kudos, you got the credibility with it. But I just want to take a moment quickly, Regia, to talk about the personal statement, if you mind, because this is something I think that's good. Your applicants, very, very quickly. This is awesome, okay? This is a real cool formula. Think about your personal statement in what I call the ABCs, okay? A, B, C, D, E, F, okay? A is for attention grabber, okay? So when you're writing your personal statement, think about your statement generally like a movie, okay? This is really, really critical. I'm telling you, this is gonna help you guys. Think about your life as a movie. How does the opening scene start? How does it pan back? How does it continue? How does it end? And trust me, when you think about that, suddenly the essay comes to life in a very beautiful way. So think about A for attention grabber. How do you start the essay, right? And how does it grab the attention of the reader? And then what context do you want to quickly provide so that the reader knows where you're going? B is for background. Think about your background, what you've done, what is your upbringing, what has influenced you, what are the values that you carry through the upbringing that you have, okay? C is for career, academic career, professional career, and talk about all the experiences that you've had in terms of what you've done based on who you are. D is for direction. Given all who you are and what you've done, where do you want to go, right? That's the direction, the goals, and so forth, right? That's very, very critical. E is for education. That's where, now that you've told us where you want to go, what you've done, who you are, now you have to tell us that you can't get to the next step unless you go to the school, unless you go to that program, unless you do that degree, unless you do that degree at that school. So you really want to talk about the educational institution. And finally, F is for finale. Bring the whole thing back full circle, right? Back to the beginning, back to the story that you have, and provide that element of continuity and that full storyline, because all movies have to end that way. You have a story that starts and that's how the human brain works. Again, A, attention grabber, B, back, C, career, D, direction, E, educational institution, and F, finale. Keep those things in mind whenever you're writing and outlining your personal statement. Boom. I literally thought about that on a walk somewhere in Santa Monica.
There you go. Thank you so much. This is a great note to end on. Thanks for everybody who joined us today. We will be posting this to our Instagram page. So if you joined late or you had to drop off early, you can still view the thing in its entirety. Thanks again, Hamada. Thank you everybody who submitted questions. Keep watching the space for other majlises like these in the future. We'll see you on the other side. Have a good one. Shukran.
Take care. Thank you so much for having me.
Bye.
Bye.